Hello everyone, and welcome back. Today, we are stepping far back in time, long before birds filled the skies, before bats learned to navigate the night, and before the air itself became a busy highway of life. Our story begins with a simple but fascinating question. Did insects suddenly learn how to fly, or was flight something that slowly took shape over time? The short answer is this: flying insects did not appear overnight. There was no single moment when an insect lifted off the ground for the first time and changed the world in an instant. Instead, flight emerged through a slow, patient process of evolution, unfolding over tens of millions of years. Small changes, repeated across countless generations, quietly reshaped bodies that were once bound to the surface of the earth. Early insects lived close to the ground. They crawled through ancient forests, climbed primitive plants, and survived by hiding, jumping, or staying still. At that time, the sky was empty: no birds, no flying mammals, and no competition above. There was no immediate need to conquer the air. And yet, nature has a way of experimenting. Tiny structural changes began to appear: flat extensions, lightweight surfaces, subtle movements that offered slight advantages. These changes did not create flight right away. Instead, they helped insects fall more slowly, glide short distances, or better control their bodies as they moved through their environment. Each improvement was small, almost unnoticeable on its own. But over immense stretches of time, those small advantages added up. What we call flight was not a sudden breakthrough, it was the final chapter of a long story already in motion. A story shaped by survival, chance, and gradual refinement. And once insects finally mastered the air, everything changed, not just for them, but for life on Earth itself. So today, let us follow that quiet transformation, step by step, and explore how one of nature's most remarkable abilities was patiently built over deep time. Before flight ever became possible, insects lived in a world where the sky was empty and unreachable. Around 400 million years ago, the earliest insects appeared on Earth, and every one of them was entirely wingless. Their lives unfolded close to the ground, in a landscape dominated by primitive plants, damp soil, and dense undergrowth. These early insects moved by crawling, climbing, or hopping short distances. They sheltered under leaves, within bark, and among early mosses and ferns. Survival depended on staying hidden, reacting quickly, and conserving energy. Speed through the air was not yet an option because no insect body was built for it. At that time, the environment placed no pressure on insects to fly. There were no birds hunting from above and no flying predators competing for space. The air was simply part of the background, not a territory to be explored. Life was slow, grounded, and limited to what could be reached on foot or leg. Importantly, these early insects already showed remarkable adaptability. Their segmented bodies, jointed legs, and hard outer coverings allowed them to survive in changing conditions. But wings were not part of the plan yet. Developing and maintaining wings would have required energy, coordination, and structural changes that offered no immediate benefit in a ground-based lifestyle. In fact, some modern insects still resemble these ancient forms. Creatures like silverfish and bristletails provide a living glimpse into this earlier stage of insect evolution. They remind us that insects were already successful long before flight entered the picture. Understanding this wingless beginning is crucial. Flight was not a starting point, it was an addition. It came only after insects had already mastered life on land. And when the conditions slowly change, nature began to experiment. The groundwork for flight was laid not in the sky, but firmly on the forest floor. When insect wings first appeared, they were not designed for flight in the way we understand it today. In fact, the earliest wing-like structures likely served completely different purposes, long before any insect could truly leave the ground. Scientists believe these early structures were small, flat extensions on the insect's body. At first glance, they may have looked insignificant thin surfaces that did not flap or generate lift. But even these simple shapes could provide subtle advantages. For insects living among plants and elevated surfaces, falling was a constant risk. A slightly broader body surface could help slow a fall, stabilize movement, or allow an insect to glide short distances instead of dropping straight down. These structures may also have played a role in temperature control, helping insects absorb or release heat more efficiently in a changing environment. Others may have aided in display, camouflage, or balance while moving across uneven surfaces. None of these functions required true flight, but all of them rewarded insects that carried these small modifications. Crucially, evolution does not plan ahead. It does not create structures for future abilities. It simply preserves traits that offer immediate, practical benefits. In this case, wing-like extensions survived because they helped insects move more safely, conserve energy, or survive accidents. Over time, these flat surfaces became larger, lighter, and more flexible. Muscles and joints slowly adapted around them. What began as passive structures eventually gained limited movement. Insects could adjust their position in the air, control descent, and change direction while falling or gliding. Flight, then, was not the original goal, it was the result of repurposing. A structure that evolved for stability, control, or protection gradually became something far more powerful. This idea helps explain why insect wings are so complex today. They are not a single invention, but a layered outcome of many earlier functions refined over deep time. In the next step of this story, we will see how some of these early insects began experimenting with life between land and water, adding another key piece to the puzzle of how flight truly began. Another key chapter in the story of insect flight begins not on land, but in the water. Many scientists believe that some of the earliest ancestors of flying insects spent part of their lives in aquatic environments. Their young stages lived underwater, breathing through external gills, soft, flat structures rich in blood vessels. These gills were not passive. They often moved gently, helping water flow across their surface to absorb oxygen more efficiently. Over time, this movement became more controlled. When some of these insects began transitioning to life on land, their bodies had to adapt quickly. Breathing changed, movement changed, and the role of these gill-like structures began to shift. Instead of disappearing, the gills may have been repurposed. As insects emerged from water and climbed onto plants or rocks, these flattened structures could help with balance, cooling, or stability. In air, even small movements of these surfaces could generate lift or control, especially during jumps or falls. What makes this idea especially compelling is modern evidence. The genes that control insect wing development today are closely related to those involved in gill formation in aquatic insects. This suggests a deep evolutionary connection, not coincidence, but continuity. In this view, wings were not invented from nothing. They were reworked tools, shaped by new environments and new challenges. Structures once used to breathe underwater slowly transformed into surfaces capable of interacting with air. Step by step, function followed form. Importantly, this transition did not happen all at once. Many intermediate forms likely existed, creatures that could neither fully fly nor fully glide, but could survive just a little better than their neighbors. And in evolution, a little better is often enough. This idea reminds us that nature rarely throws things away. Instead, it adapts, modifies, and reuses what already works. Insect wings may carry the legacy of ancient waters, proof that the path to the sky may have begun beneath the surface. True flight did not appear in a single leap. Instead, it emerged through a long sequence of small improvements, each one building on what came before. Early insects did not suddenly take off into the sky. They learned, slowly, how to stay in the air just a little longer each time. The first stage was likely controlled falling. Insects living on plants or tree-like structures often fell by accident. Those with slightly broader body surfaces or early wing-like extensions fell more slowly and landed more safely. This reduced injury and increased survival, even without any active movement in the air. Next came gliding. Instead of dropping straight down, some insects could drift sideways or forward, steering their descent toward safer landing spots. This ability did not require strong muscles or flapping wings, just the right shape and balance. Even short glides offered a clear advantage in complex environments. Over time, muscles began to attach to these surfaces. At first, movement was weak and limited, but it allowed insects to adjust direction mid-air. Tiny changes in angle could mean the difference between safety and danger. Natural selection favored insects that could control their descent more precisely. Eventually, these movements became stronger and more coordinated. Insects began to push against the air, not just fall through it. What started as simple control evolved into short bursts of lift, and finally into sustained, powered flight. Each stage worked on its own. None required a sudden transformation. And at every step, insects that gained even a small advantage were more likely to survive and reproduce. Over millions of years, these incremental changes reshaped anatomy, muscles, and behavior. Flight was not a single invention, it was a process, a gradual shift from gravity-bound movement to true freedom in the air. And once insects reached that final stage, the world above the ground was no longer empty. The moment when insects finally achieved true flight did not happen by chance. It occurred during a unique chapter in Earth's history known as the Carboniferous period, around 320 to 300 million years ago. During this time, the planet offered conditions that made flight not only possible, but highly effective. One of the most important factors was the atmosphere itself. Oxygen levels were significantly higher than they are today, allowing insects to absorb more oxygen with less effort. This mattered because early flying insects relied on simple respiratory systems. Higher oxygen made it easier to support active movement and sustained energy use in the air. The landscape also played a major role. Vast forests filled the land, dominated by tall plants and dense vegetation. For insects living among these towering structures, the ability to move vertically and horizontally through the air became incredibly useful. Flight allowed them to travel between plants, escape danger, and explore new spaces that were unreachable from the ground. With few competitors in the sky, flying insects faced little resistance. There were no birds or flying mammals yet, meaning insects became the first true masters of the air. This freedom allowed rapid diversification. Different wing shapes, sizes, and flight styles began to appear, each adapted to a specific lifestyle. Some insects grew remarkably large. Ancient dragonfly-like species reached sizes rarely seen today, their wings spanning wider than a human arm. These giants were possible because the environment supported them, not because insects suddenly changed. The Carboniferous period did not create flight on its own, but it rewarded it. Insects that had already developed early flight abilities now had every reason to refine and expand them. This era marked the turning point when flight stopped being an experiment and became a defining feature of insect success. From this moment on, the skies were no longer empty and life on Earth would never be the same. Once insects gained the ability to fly, even imperfectly, it transformed how they interacted with the world. Flight was not just a new way to move, it was a powerful survival tool that reshaped every part of insect life. With wings, insects could escape danger quickly. Instead of relying only on hiding or stillness, they could leave a risky situation in seconds. This made them harder to catch and allowed them to survive in environments that were previously too exposed or unstable. A short flight could mean the difference between survival and loss. Flight also opened access to new food sources. Insects could reach fresh plants, distant resources, and temporary environments that ground-bound creatures could not. They were no longer limited to what was nearby. This mobility reduced competition and allowed insects to spread across wide areas with ease. Reproduction changed as well. Flying insects could find mates more efficiently, increasing the chances of successful breeding. Some species developed flight-based displays or movements that helped them recognize one another, adding new layers to communication and behavior. Perhaps most importantly, flight allowed insects to colonize the planet rapidly. They crossed rivers, valleys, and changing landscapes with little resistance. Over time, this led to incredible diversity. New species adapted to forests, open plains, wetlands, and eventually almost every ecosystem on Earth. Even insects that no longer fly today often descend from flying ancestors. In some environments, wings became unnecessary or costly, and were reduced or lost. But the legacy of flight remained embedded in their biology. This advantage explains why insects became so widespread and resilient. Flight did not just help them survive, it helped them dominate. By mastering the air long before any other animals, insects secured a lasting place in Earth's story, shaping ecosystems that still depend on them today. In the final part of this journey, we will step back and ask an important question. Was there ever a single moment when flight truly began, or was it always just one small step after another? It is tempting to imagine a dramatic moment, the first insect lifting off the ground and changing history forever. But in reality, there was no single, clear beginning of flight. No sharp line separates insects that could not fly from those that could. Instead, flight emerged through a long stretch of gradual change. For millions of years, insects existed in in-between stages. Some could glide but not flap. Others could flap but not stay airborne for long. Many could control how they fell without ever truly flying. These forms did not represent failures or dead ends. Each one was a working solution for survival in a specific environment. Evolution does not aim for perfection or milestones. It favors what works right now. If a small change helped an insect land more safely, move more efficiently, or survive a little longer, that change was preserved. Over time, these tiny advantages accumulated, slowly blurring the boundary between falling, gliding, and flying. This is why scientists cannot point to a single fossil and say, this is the first flying insect. The transition was too smooth, too gradual. Every step made sense on its own, without requiring a future goal. What we call flight today is simply the point where all those small improvements finally crossed a functional threshold. But that threshold was not planned, it was discovered through countless experiments carried out by nature itself. Understanding this helps explain why flight appears complex and refined. It is not the result of a sudden leap, but of patience on a geological scale. Flight was not invented in a moment, it emerged quietly, shaped by time, chance, and survival. In the final section, we will step back and see what this long journey tells us about evolution itself and why insect flight remains one of nature's most remarkable achievements. When insects finally crossed the threshold into true flight, the impact went far beyond their own survival. Flight reshaped ecosystems, altered food chains, and influenced the evolution of countless other species. Flying insects became powerful agents of change. They moved pollen between plants, helping vegetation spread and diversify. They carried nutrients across landscapes and became a vital food source for animals that would evolve much later. Entire ecological relationships began to form around their presence in the air. Because insects were the first animals to fly, they set the rules of the sky long before birds or flying mammals appeared. By the time new flying creatures evolved, insects were already everywhere, diverse, adaptable, and deeply embedded in the environment. This early advantage made them incredibly difficult to replace or outcompete. Flight also made insects more resilient to change. As climates shifted and landscapes transformed, flying insects could relocate quickly. They were not trapped by rivers, mountains, or fragmented habitats. This mobility helped them survive mass extinctions and environmental disruptions that wiped out many other forms of life. Even today, the legacy of that ancient breakthrough is visible. Insects remain the most diverse group of animals on Earth, with millions of species filling nearly every ecological role imaginable. Their success is not due to size or strength, but to adaptability, and flight sits at the center of that adaptability. The story of insect flight reminds us that small changes can have enormous consequences. What began as subtle adjustments for balance or control eventually transformed the planet. The skies, once empty and silent, became alive with movement, and life on Earth took a new direction because of it. When we look back at the long story of insect flight, one truth becomes clear: there was no miracle moment. No sudden leap. No instant transformation. Flight was the outcome of patience played out over deep time, through countless small changes that quietly added up. Each step made sense on its own. A slightly wider surface. A better controlled fall. A small movement that improved balance. None of these changes promised flight. They only offered a small advantage in the present moment, and that is how evolution works. It does not plan for the future. It responds to what helps survival right now. Over millions of years, these modest improvements stacked together. Bodies adapted. Muscles strengthened. Control improved. What began as simple stability slowly became gliding, then brief lift, and finally sustained movement through the air. By the time true flight existed, it felt almost inevitable, but only in hindsight. This is why insect flight is one of evolution's most powerful examples. It shows how complexity can emerge without intention, design, or sudden breakthroughs. Just time, variation, and survival doing their quiet work. And the result speaks for itself. Insects did not just learn to fly, they reshaped the planet. They filled the skies long before any other animals dared to leave the ground. Their wings carried them across forests, continents, and eras, helping them endure when others disappeared. So when we ask whether insects suddenly learned to fly, the answer is no. They learned slowly, one generation at a time. And in doing so, they remind us that some of the greatest transformations in nature happen not with drama, but with persistence. That quiet journey from ground to sky is what makes the story of insect flight truly extraordinary. As we reach the end of today's journey, one idea stands out clearly: insect flight was not a sudden breakthrough, but a story written over immense stretches of time. It began on the ground, with small creatures adapting to their environment step by step, long before the sky ever became a destination. Through countless tiny changes, each useful in its own moment, those early insects slowly gained control over the air and reshaped life on Earth. This long, patient process reminds us that nature often works quietly. The most extraordinary abilities are not always born from dramatic moments, but from persistence, adaptation, and time. Insect wings carry the history of that process, a record of survival, experimentation, and gradual success. Thank you for spending this time exploring one of nature's most fascinating transformations with me. If you enjoyed this story, take a moment to reflect on how many other hidden journeys are written into the living world around us. And as always, I appreciate you being here. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and I will see you again soon.